Thank you, John, for that introduction. It's good to be here today, sharing some more ideas with everyone in regards to the idea of immortality as it's primarily expressed in some of the Theosophical teachings. I must admit that the initial thought to speak on immortality seemed easy enough, but as I began to look into some of the nuances, it seems that the field of what it embraced really expanded. So hopefully we can keep things in a structured manner that flows in a way that can be relatively easily followed. The topic immortality is one that has been around in thought as long as mankind. So clearly there are systems and traditions and philosophies that speak about the belief of immortality. Very few that I am familiar with speak about the clear dynamics of what that might be and what that might look like, as well as some of the particulars in regards to how that might happen. Theosophy is an exception in that regards, although, again, even some of those details are more open to interpretation. But we'll try to present a wide view of some of the theosophical ideas that allow us to at least begin to conceptualize immortality in a way that is within our grasp, so to speak, and a little bit more believable, we hope, than just having to believe it on blind faith. Especially blind faith, because as we think about the key to theosophy, HPP talks about that and indicates that faith without knowledge clearly is not the path that we should be taking. So in regards to what is immortality, the typical definitions have to do with a person or a godlike person that can live throughout eternity. That word eternity holds many different interpretations. And so the question of how long a being can be alive brings in the concept of time. And time as a philosophical concept is still, again, something that's being debated even in our sciences today. But the one thing that we can say is that it involves the idea of succession. So when two things exist and one follows another in some type of relationship, we can begin to differentiate what was conceptually before, what is apparently here now, and then what is moving into the future, i.e. has left us in the past. And so those three ideas, past, present, and future, in terms of a particular length of time, bring in those ideas concerning cycles. And in general thought, let's say in religious thought, again, eternity does not have a designated number of years or necessarily time. In science, we're definitely looking at larger numbers. And so, for instance, if the Earth itself is considered to be 4.5 billion years old, then eternity would have to be conceptualized within that time frame. If we're looking at the duration of the universe, and that's considered to be 13.7 billions of years. And we're asking, is there the possibility for being immortal for that period of time? It clearly demonstrates a difference in how we conceptualize the term immortality. Even bringing it down to our everyday thinking, if we typically live anywhere from 80 to 100 years, and we compare that to the typical lifespan of a fly, that may be around 3-4 days or so, clearly in a relative manner, we are living in eternity if we could think in the conceptualizations of the fly. And so again, eternity becomes relative, time becomes relative, and therefore the idea of immortality for a duration of time becomes relative. And so we'll come back to that because Theosophy does address that idea. The other question that comes up is, what is possibly immortal? And so we are familiar with the terms body, in Theosophical terminology, the astral body. We're familiar with the terms soul, spirit, and mind, and consciousness. And these are terms that are used in many different philosophies, in many different systems. And when it comes to mind, consciousness, and idea of self, these are terms that are being explored from a neurobiological aspect as it relates to brain function and how we transcribe signals into subjective experiences. And so understanding what these terms seem to imply becomes important, because when we talk about immortality, minimally we have to talk about immortality from the perspective of a particular consciousness. We can't necessarily talk about the qualifications of that consciousness other than it is minimally an awareness that takes into its conceptions the passage of time and can compare that to other passages of time such that it sees, for lack of a better way of explaining it, multiple cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, or night, day, night, day. So again, we're looking at the idea of successions. We're looking at the idea of eternal cyclic processes, and somewhere we're putting in an observer or a witness or a consciousness that is aware of these passages of time differently than it is aware of its persistence in perceiving the passages of time. So when we look in religious thought, again, some religious thinkers embrace the idea that the body itself, the physical body, can be resurrected, that it can exist for an extended period of time. If we were talking specifically about Christian tradition, we would be talking about a place like heaven. As we'll see when we're talking about Theosophical ideas, we're talking about a state of consciousness noted as devachan or devachan. And so these states versus places also become elements that we have to consider if we are realistically going to explore and examine the possibility of immortality, that possibility of immortality being linked to a consciousness, and that consciousness perhaps being linked either to a locale, place, or a state. And so if we then switch and talk about, for instance, science, science is looking for these very things. From the point of view of science, the body is a molecular aggregation of molecules, cells, organs that are contained within an outlining form of skin or body. And at the time of death, these organs stop functioning, the body shuts down, consciousness cannot be located, and so everything then is extinct. There are other views of science as it relates to what mind is, either independent of neurobiological functioning related to the brain or totally dependent on that. And as we speak, there are, I believe, in a magazine that was put out recently, 5 different ways of looking at consciousness as it relates to the brain. Some of those are just as old as the ideas and thoughts that were existing in HPV's days, and some of them are kind of reworked and somewhat new, but they involve concepts about the illusion of all of this, because we can never truly see or experience what our senses are presenting to us. They present signals, electrical signals that are integrated within the brain. And so what they really represent is not what's being presented and put together as a gestalt in our brain that we become aware of as a mental representation. There are those that just think it's pure physical, it's all just matter, neurological substance, and the mind itself doesn't exist. And so when the brain stops functioning, everything stops again, body goes, dust to dust, nothing continues. There are those that are entertaining that idea, another old one about panpsychism, or the idea that all is consciousness, and that consciousness is affiliated and inherent within the very substance, so that even all of the particles that appear to be inorganic, although that's not a term that Theosophy typically agrees with, may still have consciousness. And if consciousness, then we can look at them as possibly in the field of evolutionary existence and growth and possible self-reflective consciousness at some time, and then possibly eternal or immortal. All of these thoughts, all of these ideas still don't really put together a consistent system that embraces perhaps all of these ideas. And just to be clear, again, this is a recently published magazine. It's called The Essential Guide number 12 from the New Scientist on Consciousness. And one of the articles speaks about the 5 different ways to think about consciousness and how it's functioning. One is dualistic, that brain and mind are different. One is monistic, that it's all one and the same thing. One is physicalism, and that has to do with the laws of physics explaining all mental phenomena based on electrical signals and neurological tissue. The other is panpsychism, as we spoke about, and the other has to do with the idea that we see representations, hence we don't deal with the realities, and all of this is an illusion and we'll never get it. All of these become important when we're trying to understand the idea and the possibility of immortality, because if things go from dust to dust, then where do we look for the intelligence that is supposed to exist for an eternity? Where do we look for the body that is supposed to exist? From a theosophical perspective, there are basically 2 things that meet the full criteria, so to speak, for immortality. One of the teachers of Theosophy said that immortality can be nothing less than the eternal, continuous continuity of consciousness, unbroken by any particular state that it goes through. And that consciousness then, in theosophical terms, would be a consciousness that fully embraces the beginning of a huge cycle towards the end of a huge cycle. But stepping back even further than that, they speak about the one thing unconditionally that has to be immortal, and that one thing is life. Their definition of life has to do with that power and that energy or force that is constantly present, whether forms are present or not. It is represented in theosophical thought through the idea of space. And HPB says that space is that which is, despite whether or not any object or form is present in it, and the absence of those forms or form neither affect the space itself. So space is considered to be representative of that one life that always is, that is never altered, and is immutable in its true nature, hence is the background upon which all cycles of time can be expressed. If it's the background upon which all cycles of time can be expressed, it is another way of saying it is the background upon which the idea of all succession can be expressed. And once we erase that succession, if that is possible, then we are looking at a background that exists in, as she says in the Secret Doctrine, duration. And duration is superior to any type of space, time, or dimensionality. And so when the teachers talk about that one life that is imperishable and is the background for all expression, that is the one and only thing that is considered to be unconditionally immortal. And yet when we think about that, that does not hold consciousness as we are used to thinking about it. Although the way we think about consciousness as related to the way our brains perceive and cogitate and come up with ideas is clearly not the end state of what consciousness in its totality can be. The other thing as an idea or a concept that is considered to be immortal in theosophical thought is that called the monad. And that monad is considered to be the condition of the absolute spiritual state of, we'll put the word substance or matter in quotes, which is considered atmic in nature, universal, non-divided, or perhaps non-dual, all pervasive, and present in every formulated particle that expresses itself on the screen of space, if we can use that expression. The life is one, and then the vehicle or the first localizing forces that contain portions of that spirit which pervades it is considered to be the Buddhic aspect or the vehicle of that force. So for myself, instead of trying to think in such grand, universal, boundless terms, I just think of a small circle, perhaps similar to the Secret Doctrine, and pervading that circle is life. And yet now we have another little challenge, because when we use the word life, we have to begin to expand the meaning of that term. And life itself will embrace force. It will embrace light. It will embrace energy. And HPB gives us a progression, so to speak, in the SD that begins with the concept or idea of omniscience that is inherent within what she would call that logoic light. And that omniscience then gives rise to workable, and I'm just using that as a term, intelligible substance. That intelligible substance with its own properties and forces, in a sense, creates its own conceptual mental space. And she indicates some of this in that section of the secret doctrine referred to as God's monads and atoms. And that intelligible state will then create force in motion, which is looked at as will. That will create force. That force will create energy. And energy, we know, is equal to so-called MC squared, i.e. matter. So there is a whole continuum, all one substance yet manifesting differently, that expresses itself, that is related to an intelligible substratum that holds the possibility for what we consider expressions of consciousness or self-awareness. And so, again, when we're looking at these ideas of immortality, we typically shrink them and say, oh, it's about us, it's about my body, it's about me, and I'm going to be immortal, and I'm going to be resurrected, or whatever. But Theosophy breaks that mold. And so when we're really beginning to look into the dynamics of what these ideas bring to our awareness in regards to what immortality embraces, from a theosophical perspective, we're really talking about universals. And so in that respect, when intelligible force and intelligible cognition or cognitive ability is inherent within substance, as a segue, one of the teachers in the Mahatma letters said, if matter can so-called fall or be attracted to the earth and called gravity, why cannot matter think? And so the implication in that little quip is that there may be more properties inherent within the very substances that we have not yet found or discovered that have different abilities, cogitative abilities, awareness type abilities, that under the proper conditions can cohere as fields or spheres of force, that force being consciousness itself, and when embodied in some type of organizational structure. And the teachers talk about that of the Dhyan Chohans, does exist, does function, is aware, does have consciousness of its own unique type, and will exist for a long period of time. And so the idea that life is truly immortal, the idea that its representation in the Atma Buddhi or the monad is immortal, gives us the beginning points from a theosophical perspective and helps us apply that idea or those ideas universally to the universe. Even if we have to include the multiverse there, we can apply those ideas and those localizations to galaxies and to solar systems, as well as to particular globes. And we say particular globes because the teachers indicate that all globes are not man-bearing. And that implies that all globes do not bring forth consciousness in their evolutionary states. So again, just to review for a moment, when we are looking at consciousness from a theosophical perspective, when we're looking at immortality from a theosophical perspective, and when we're looking at the idea of what is possibly immortal, these ideas are at the forefront of theosophical thought. As another one of the teachers stated, the monad in its Atma-Buddhic nature, in its spiritual force nature, contained within its own unique vehicle, is eternal. And it will exist throughout the duration of the Manvantara or the universe. And it is up to the personality to find a way to link itself up with that monad if portions of it would be embraced throughout that eternity. And when portions of what we do and live and aspire to on earth are linked up with that monad, that is called the linkage of the Satratma, or the Satratma being that monad that is eternal and is the true individuality, and yet the nature of it is not self-reflective consciousness that is able to maintain self-consciousness as an object of its own perception. And that's a tongue twister, but it's one of the definitions that one of the teachers used as important for understanding what self-conscious immortality would be. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So once we introduce the idea of the monad, that typically lets everyone know that is aware of theosophical thought that we're talking about the 7 principles. And whether we look at those as separate principles or whether we look at them as all rolling out in time and space from one principle, i.e. the monadic essence, or we look at them from different points of view, at this time for me is kind of immaterial. So the basic idea is that if this monad is there, and if we again, a little segue, think about the proem, and we think about the review of the 7 stanzas, that third stanza after the preparation for the awakening from pralaic state has to do with the reemergence of the monads. And she tells us again, they can be universal, they can be galactic, they can be individual. And so that third stanza then is the foundation for the rolling out of everything else that follows. And so likewise, that monad in some respects is the rolling out for the rest of our principles. And those principles everyone is familiar with in terms of terminology, i.e. we've got the Atma, we've got the Buddhi as that monadic, then we've got manasic. And that is supposed to be the seat of self-conscious intelligence that can, when reflected in the appropriate conditions of matter, give rise to thought and thinking. HPB describes that manasic aspect as a spirit or as a force or as an angel in the key to Theosophy, chapter 10. And so just to express that manasic principle in those 3 simple ways lets us know that it is not necessarily one thing, that it is something that has its own unique properties, its own unique type of substance, and that substance itself can be eternal as long as in its purest aspect it links up with that monad, or it can be degraded. as it links up with what we call that fourth principle from the top down, karma. But the interesting thing about the karmic principle, it also has its high and low aspects, because there's the Kamadeva, which is the real, true God of love and force of attraction, of, you might even say, that centripetal force in nature that pulls things together, that gives rise to the very manifestation of the universe. But then there's also that brute, passional side that simply goes after sensual pleasures. And it's that side that tends to be less than immortal. So for myself, I just tend to think of it as a three-pronged thing. There is an aspect of manas that is eternal in potential. There is an aspect of manas that is semi-eternal, because it's quite there in the middle. And then there is an aspect of manas that just gets dragged away because we've wasted the energy. And that part that gets dragged away can be more affiliated with that karmic piece that can be pure brute passional, or just desires or wants, or it can be raised to the highest, and then we begin to look at the possibility of will and volition in force for the higher good. But after that principle of passion, then we speak about prana as life, and HPB says that jiva is universal life, prana can be seen as life within particular form. And so that is a transformation of that universal force that is present within any organizational structure. And we're saying organizational structure as opposed to a physical body, because immortality demands more than a physical body, which we'll kind of get to. And then after that, we're talking about the astral, which is that matrix, sometimes spoken of as the molecular aspect of the physical body, depending upon what portions of the teachings we're using. Sometimes spoken of as an energy body, sometimes spoken of simply as the matrix, or the field of force within which organizational structure and manifestation occur. And then we have the physical. And HPB says point blank that the physical is simply a result of the terrestrial forces acting on the electromagnetic pattern body and the manifestation of those terrestrial accretions. So we're talking about a physical body that is really not even our body, but a reflection of what the inner astral body might be. We're talking about the passions and desires, the life energy, the vital principles, and then we're moving into the mind, and then we move into the eternal foundation of our being. And so every aspect of life has within it those aspects of sevenfold principles. And if we're going to be really complete, as Mr. Judge says, and as HPB says in certain articles, really there's only one principle. And that principle reflects itself in 3 forms and subsequently 7. For those that are familiar with Subbarao's work in the text 5 Years of Theosophy, he speaks about the threefold aspect of the Brahmanic and Advaita teachings in terms of Parabrahm, Sakti, and Prakriti, and how those 3 aspects, very similar to Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, come together in different formations to create or to manifest the sevenfold principles. Now, why is all of this even vaguely important? It's important from the conceptual side because it gives us a structure that allows us to think clearly about a process that we will probably want to begin to pursue if we ever become serious about theosophical life, theosophical service in different ways, and what our evolutionary possibilities are. But getting back to this sevenfold division, When we're talking about the physical, the astral, the passional, the life principle, the monastic, and the duad of Atma Buddhi, we now have a clearer idea of what any tradition is talking about when they say physical body, soul, mind, resurrection, what can resurrect, what cannot resurrect. So from a theosophical perspective, we have to keep in mind at least the diagrammatic picture of the triangle and the square. That triangle represents everything as a trinity that can be maintained throughout time and space for long periods of time, i.e., anything that is able to link up with the monad, whether it is containing self-reflective power or simply impressions of deeds that were done, that were noble, and that were pure to the degree that mind could resonate with Buddhi, can be sustained within that triadic immortal state. Everything in the square is what we just like to think of it as the recyclable matter that we use. And yet, a thing we have to consider if we're really, really pushing these theosophical ideas is that as HPB talks to us about the 49 fires, each of those pseudo principles, i.e., again, one principle, 7 manifestations, each of those are sevenfold. So what does that mean? That means that in what we call physical, there is something that is analogous or similar to, or perhaps like Atma Buddhi. In the so-called astral, its highest principles will be Atma Buddhic-like. Similarly, in terms of life and passion, even in terms of mind and Buddhi, we typically don't talk about that Buddhic domain. And HPB basically says you've got a hard enough time trying to figure out the monastic domain, forget about the Buddhic. And yet it has to be experientially known in order for even illusions to be made about it, and for traces of its abilities and properties to overshadow certain individuals such that they speak about things in a completely different way than we're typically used to understanding day to day. And so those 4 lower principles that we spoke about are considered to be the conglomerations, the aggregations, the putting together of, for lack of a better word, we'll use the common word, atoms. And if the atoms are coming together and being held together and then presenting themselves as different physical or electromagnetic properties with different abilities in concert, they can then be taken apart. So whatever is put together comes apart. And HPB talks about this in terms of psychic and noetic action. That article, I'm sure most folks listening are familiar with. And she speaks even about the higher aspect of the cell as being noetic and consciousness being able to resonate with that. And when those things begin to occur in mass and with purpose, certain phenomena begin to become known, and certain states of consciousness and their properties and abilities become known. Because now, when we're using a noetic state of consciousness, we're resonating with a noetic state of being. So what we experience, what we metaphorically see, taste, touch, hear, resonate with, become, assimilate, is going to be different than the concrete objects that we encounter day to day. But the point being, again, that whatever we're putting together gets pulled apart. And so the gradation of putting things together, if we reflect on page 200 of The Secret Doctrine, that diagram again that everyone is familiar with, the triangle on the top three planes, and then the circles for the periods of evolutionary states on the four lower planes. But the words that are being used there are the archetypal plane, the creative plane, the formative plane, and the manifest physical plane. And what these indicate is not that they're just separate, but as said in the teachings, they are interdependent, they are connected, they are within each other. So within, relatively speaking, and again, because time and spatial factors are somewhat different when we're conceptualizing them versus when we're experiencing them. But within the physical, you'll find the astral, and within the astral, you'll find that power or atoms or whatever you want to name those particular centers of force. You will find those, and then within those, you will find an archetypal type structure. And you can think of that simply as the inner nucleus with its inherent force that creates its own orbit and radius around which other particles fall into place, similar to the solar system, similar to an atom, such that the manifestation that occurs is inherent within the very archetypal seed that was there at the first step away from the arupic planes or the monastic planes or whatever. And so this brings into play the idea that for, again, appreciating immortality, that we have to consider three lines of evolutionary expression. HPB says in The Secret Doctrine, one, the monadic and its higher phases of spiritual and divine expression. The other, the monastic, and that range of intelligible force that expresses itself through different kinds of matter differently. So if the force could express itself through different forms of neurological matter, the nature of thought and idea perhaps would be different than what we're typically used to thinking and how we're typically used to thinking. The third has to do with the physical forms and what we would identify as the lunapitries, the monastic as the solar or the Agnishwata, and then the Atmabuddhic, the monadic, as really related to the logoic aspect of our being in its threefold nature as the light of Devi Prakriti. And why does this become important? It becomes important for recognizing that as mental beings, again, we can oscillate or resonate on three different levels. One level is with the lower four, and we can engage in the sensual, the still good things, but the temporary, because that whole recyclable lower four planes has to be put together, taken apart for the growth, expression, and evolutionary complexity of the vehicles that are necessary for the awakening monadic intelligence. Yet the second then is the monastic, and that can pertain to high levels of ideation, love, aspiration, practice, etc. But then a third aspect of that is what we typically call the higher mind. And we always don't make differentiations about the higher mind, but in this particular case, in a few places, HPB talks about the higher mind as that which is superior to the devaconic state. Not everyone awakens that state of consciousness, lives in it, works from it, thinks from it, and serves humanity from it. And that's still not the bodhisattvic state. But why do these three divisions become important? Because if The monad is Atma Buddhi, is the only unconditional vehicle of immortality, putting aside that universal life. It actually rests on the universal life. So you might say its internal subjective side is that omniscience. Its external side is that omniscience reflected in a particular field. And that is immortal. And when that higher mind, which is superior to the devaconic state, pursues its development, it is that which HPB tells us can resonate and link itself fully with the monad and attain divine immortal consciousness. And so we've got to recognize again that the way that we typically live every day, eating, sleeping, going to work, having fun with our friends, etc., is important, but it is not important in terms of the immortality. The higher feelings that we have, the love, the aspirations, the willingness to help, the wanting to share, the wanting to make the world a better place, can get us into that devaconic state after the gestation of the separation of the higher from the lower and the kamarupic dregs, versus that which can go into the devaconic state. But that higher mind state then brings us to the realm of aspirants, disciples, initiates, who practice a particular way of living, such that, as the teachers tell us in the Mahatma letters and Subbarao gives us in his article, Consciousness and Immortality, the goal is to be able to refine that monastic functionality and state to such a degree, and to lift up the Atma-Buddhic aspect of volition and karma to such a degree that they are able to resonate fully with that Buddhic condition that is immortal. When that happens, there is an impression that takes place. In addition to that, the teachers talk about the self-conscious ability to transfer consciousness in its integral state of self-reflection that is aware of not the person, but the personal state of consciousness that takes on an identity, such that that is not lost, and that fullness of watcher, of focal point that engages matter, is held together in its integrity and impressed within that Buddhic state. And that is expressed by the idea of being able to go from one state condition to another without losing the awareness, which is why the definition is a continuous state of consciousness, unbroken, that embraces self-reflection and awareness without getting lost. When that state, which is a very difficult state to achieve and to pursue and maintain, is impressed in the Buddhic state, now we are talking about the beginnings of self-reflective, conscious immortality. But that immortality, as the teachers say, since it is in time and space, has to be developed, and it can be developed from life to life, from round to round, from globe to globe. And they speak about that in terms of the solar Manvantara, the global Manvantaras, the root races, rounds, and subraces, i.e. the ability to continue consciousness throughout all of the states that typically break up, i.e. death, the Bardo states of death or the intermediate states of death, going through the devachanic state and yet not succumbing to the devachanic illusion, such then being superior to that state. Hence, one will be in something similar, but not subject to illusion. And that becomes understandable when the teachers talk about the souls that are pure enough to resonate with souls in the devachanic state. And there's a choice then that they can maintain their awareness or lose their awareness to some degree for the full impression of the entity in that state and transmit that message completely and fully. And the words don't actually capture the ideas that have been put in those letters that the teachers wrote about these processes, but they point to that. And so again, when we're talking about immortality, getting back to the idea of cycles, there's going to be different levels of immortality or the ability of a being to consciously carry self-reflective conscious awareness from one state, plane, globe to another. And so again, that can be one life, that can be 10 lives, that can be a round or multiple rounds. And as the teachers say, if they lose the full integrity of their consciousness in that process, then they will be subject to birth and death just like all of us, i.e. born unconsciously, even though karmically they will be able to pursue that path and regain some of that, relatively speaking, quicker than most. And as an example of such beings, in the Secret Doctrine 206 to 209, we're given the teaching about the Watcher, the Great Initiate, the Instructor, who stands at the head of all lineages of true spiritual souls who are living for the purpose of helping humanity in any particular category of science, religion, philosophy, or even daily life. And so thinking about these ideas of immortality, thinking about the principles that are involved, which are really one principle, and even that opens up a whole different realm of thinking in terms of the what, the who, the how, the why, the where. And so, again, the beauty of all of this is that it presents a picture and an evolutionary potential that is amazing. It gives a firm foundation for the necessity of karma and reincarnation. Why? Because when consciousness cannot attain that immortality little by little or in fullness, if consciousness is 100% and you're able to impress 50% in that booty, speaking very loosely, then 50% may end up in devachan. And that 50% then is contributed to that rebirth. And so the states of consciousness, the principles that we have to purify, the practices that we have to engage in are all geared towards that state of self-reflective consciousness. Those that have read the article, The Elixir of Life, in the Theosophist and the 5 Years of Theosophy, have been given a brief understanding of that process. But the terms are used differently. The process is spoken about differently, but we're talking about a very similar process. And when it comes to the vehicles, we have to remember that manas and akasa are considered to be the domains of true form, the power, the essence, the ability, the true construct or image, the paradigmatic image of all universal ability is in that monastic state. The archetypal as the beginning for the manifestation of that form through those lower planes is in that lower state. But again, when we begin to understand that, we can begin to understand how mind can create the vehicles that we can call the Nirmanakaya vesture, the Sambhogakaya vesture, and the term, the Dharmanakaya vesture looking outward, not inward, but outward. And all of these embrace certain degrees of, again, immortality. And there is still so much more that could be said in terms of clarifying these ideas and applying them succinctly to the different states, to the different principles, to their own sub-principles, and looking at the process of how impressions are transferred from one principle to another such that they can be laid down in that Buddhic field for eternities and self-reflective consciousness. The teachings state that those that are successful in that process become the Dhyani Chohans. They can step from one form to another because they understand those laws. And one idea in physics or the science of cosmology that contributes a little bit to this understanding is the idea that information that the universe acquires, however that information is defined, is not loss. The destruction of forms does not destroy the information. And so when we begin to put all of these pieces of the puzzle together, we're now looking at ideas similar to samskaras and skandhas and how they rest within the field of mind. So science hasn't gotten, even though it's gotten to the level of Higgs particles that give mass to other particles and the idea of the so-called Big Bang, etc., they still have not gotten to that mental plane that Theosophy talks about, wherein the energies and forces that can contribute to immortality and self-conscious awakening for servicing humanity and all of sentient life exists. So again, don't want to bore you with more. We've extended a lot of ideas out there and used up a lot of time. So look at the teachings, look at these works, look at these ideas, and we guarantee that they will expand your way of thinking about the concept of immortality. Thank you.